let me just say it's really, really bad. And I think the way to think about it is like everybody on the planet we're all packed in an airplane. And then some people are in first class and everybody else is in like coach, and some people have the seats that don't recline because they're up against the back. If you ever take a long flight and you get those seats that don't go back, it's like the worst ever. Or you think you got a great seat because there's a little bit of extra leg room, but you realize you can't recline because it's the emergency exit's right behind you. Everybody's on the plane, right? And we suddenly realize that the plane's going to crash. And actually we discovered that the plane is going to crash and there's no getting out of the plane crash, right? There's nothing we can do to change the fact that we've lost some of our engines and we are going to crash this plane, right? And we've also realized that the reason we're going to crash is because we put way too many people in first class and we allowed them to bring way too much crap on the plane, right? And that's the situation we're in. There's no getting out of the crash. I think that's one of the most important things for people to wrap their brains around. There's no getting out of the crash. So there's a couple ways we can deal with this problem. One way we can deal with the problem is to try and get as many people as we can into first class, because quite frankly, that is the most comfortable ride on the way down, right? However, doing that simply expedites the problem, right? It makes the problem worse, right? Now the people who are already in first class, they're like, it's easy to not notice that the plane's, it's easy to be in denial because they're giving you free drinks, right? You're getting free drinks on the way down, right? So it's easy to want to stay in first class. It's really hard to imagine getting out of first class, right? Now if you're in one of those seats that don't recline and you're looking out the window and you see that things are going bad, or you're right over the engine and you can see that the engine is missing, you're like trying to figure out what to do, right? Some people are trying to rush their way into first class. Some people are trying to get some of the stuff in first class out, right? So the smart thing to do is to say, okay, let's take a serious and meaningful assessment of everything that's on the plane. Let's rip out all the pillows, all the luggage, all the fancy stuff out of first class, all the stuff everywhere, and redistribute it. Let's make sure that the people who are the most vulnerable when we hit the ground have the greatest amount of padding. And let's do it's gonna be a nasty ride, but let's try and level the plane, and when we hit the ground, let's see if the damage can be equitably and fairly distributed among the greatest number of people with the least amount of pain, knowing that there's gonna be pain. And that process of figuring that out together is what's gonna help us figure out what to do when we hit the ground, right? That's what we want, right? Copenhagen was the process of people in first class trying to steal stuff from people in the rest of the plane to make the crash more comfortable on the way down, right? To actually get them to try and serve the drinks. Right? So without getting into the details of how we are facing catastrophic loss of biological and cultural diversity on this planet that will ultimately lead to likely the loss of 50% of the human population in the next 150 years. Without getting into all of the details of that, just understand that things are really bad and we need to do something about it now. And the solutions need to be systemic in nature. So because of that, people who are on the front lines of the root causes of the problem, on the front lines of the false solutions to the problem, are mobilizing and forming a movement called the climate justice movement, which really, calling it climate justice, is sort of like the movement about everything, right? It's climate. It is atmospheric space, right? It's everything. It's the relationship between the sun, which is every drop of energy ever on this planet, ever. Every time you move a finger, it came from the sun, right? It's all the energy on the planet related to all the water that goes from fresh to salt to fresh to salt and is constantly in a cycle, right? In its relationship with air and soil and forests. Okay. This is, I'm going to start with a series of actors in Copenhagen, in the climate negotiations, that actually have a lot of moral authority and who are really important voices in this process. One of them is the Association of Small Island States, and this is actually the president of Maldives and the entire Maldives cabinet signing a declaration calling for rapid steep reductions in carbon emissions underwater, to make the point that no matter what we do now, we have already committed to the loss of their island nation. It doesn't matter what we do. They're gone. The Indigenous Peoples. The Indigenous Peoples Caucus is a formal UN body, but it represents and brings together indigenous peoples from all over the world. Indigenous peoples are the holders of the evolved knowledge of place, the inextricable relationship between the ethnosphere and the biosphere, the thin band of life on the planet, of all life on the planet, and the culture that's intertwined with it, is held within the body of knowledge, primarily of indigenous peoples and traditional peoples. And they are on the front lines of a lot of the crisis around climate. So indigenous peoples, and this is actually Clayton Thomas Mueller, who is from Canada and works with Indigenous Environmental Network, and they led, on the first days of the climate summit, they led a prayer ceremony within the halls of the convention. Another credible and important player in all of this from the climate justice perspective is the African Union, the African states, who are again on the front lines of climate disruption, who obviously are on the front lines of the equity fight. It's the same thing, right? It is the overconsumption of other people's resources, including their labor, that got us into this situation. Early on in the climate negotiations, they walked out and had an intervention around the fact that proposals were being circulated through backroom deals that essentially committed them to that. And one of the things that the head of the African Union said is, we will not sign a suicide pact. Turns out that they did, many of them anyway. This is, again, indigenous peoples from South America, but particularly from Bolivia. Bolivia was one of the few governments who participated in the climate negotiations whose negotiators were actually indigenous peoples. And they participated fully within the processes. Now, I just want to be clear that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the processes that are embodied in that thing aren't going to give us what we want. It does not have the capacity to give us what we want. But it does have the capacity to make our lives miserable as we fight for getting what we want. And so we do have a responsibility to take advantage of the platform that's created there to advance our agenda. And I'm going to get to that as quickly as I can, and I'm going to get timed. Cool. Youth. The youth within the Copenhagen moment played a really important role as being a moral voice of the future. A huge part of people's understanding about catastrophic climate destabilization is that it's about the future, which is actually kind of not true. It's actually about what we do right now. However, some of the most, the consequences are forward-going, and we're leaving this to 2 and 3 generations from that. It's about a 1,000-year bad situation, but the next few hundred years are pretty harsh. And so the youth played a really important role in being a sort of moral voice within the process, within the climate justice processes. All of these voices that I just mentioned, totally marginalized within the actual negotiations in Copenhagen. What makes communities care about a political moment like that is the implications for their organizing on the ground in their communities. So you can see me, I'm in the red keffiyeh there in the corner. So this was the folks who are fighting the Athabascan tar sands project. The tar sands is the extraction of oil literally out of tar sand. It is considered one of the most, potentially the most single destructive development project in the history of industrial development projects. I don't know how far back we want to go. Slavery and colonialism, pretty sucky. But in terms of a single industrial development project, it's really bad. Now, there's actually an important thing to note, to make about ecology, to make a point here. So the people on the front lines of the tar sands extraction, this is the idea of trying to squeeze oil out of mud, which will then be shipped to the United States and refined in power plants and in refineries in the United States to make fuel. In order to engage in this process, not only do you have to destroy the Athabascan boreal forests, which are really one of the lungs of the planet, you also have to completely destroy the sovereign rights of the indigenous peoples. And one of the things that they want to do to quote-unquote offset that project is to create private dams, mega dams, that will produce quote-unquote green electricity, hydroelectric, all up and down the Mackenzie River and a couple other rivers that run through this region. This is called an offset, which is a key thing if you kind of pay attention to climate negotiations. This is a key thing to know about.